as part of its investigation into the Epstein files. We want to discuss with a member of the House Oversight Committee. Democratic Congresswoman Yassamin Ansari of Arizona joins us right now. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us. Can you share what you've learned from Alex Acosta so far?
I just stepped out of the transcribed interview with Alex Acosta. We'll be heading back in. We've had several hours of questioning where primarily we are trying to, first of all, understand why Alex Acosta struck such a sweetheart deal for Jeffrey Epstein, why he helped Jeffrey Epstein evade the law. And I'm going to be quite honest with you. Thus far, Alex Acosta does not seem to be a credible witness to me. He is extremely evasive, very difficult to get straightforward answers out of him regarding what happened during this time, what he knew of the relationship between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, why he only focused on a single state prosecution, did not charge Jeffrey Epstein for federal crimes. And also, and I think most importantly, we asked him about whether or not he was aware that during that extremely light sentence of 18 months, of which Jeffrey Epstein only ended up serving 13 months, was Alex Acosta aware that Jeffrey Epstein went on to rape and abuse young girls at that exact time, which is something that I heard directly from one of those girls, now a woman, a couple of weeks ago during our closed-door testimony. So, and he claims to not know anything about that. He is not showing any remorse. He does not seem to think that he did, in fact, strike a sweetheart deal. He thinks that justice was, in fact, served in this case. So I intend to go back in there with many more questions. But thus far, I have more questions than I did when I walked into the room this morning.
When you say that he's being evasive, Congresswoman, is he pleading the fifth? Can you give us a more sort of specific view of the way that he's trying to answer these questions, if at all?
Absolutely. Oversight Democrats are asking a lot of questions about, again, looking back in hindsight, what does he think about the deal that was made? What sort of communication he may have gotten from either Donald Trump himself or from Jeffrey Epstein and his associates or wealthy individuals. He says a lot of things like, I don't remember, this was 20 years ago. I need to, really a lot of prefacing before getting into the questions. Members have had to say multiple times to him, this is a yes or no question, being quite evasive. The other part that's been notable to me as well is when you ask him questions about the details of the case, like, for example, who was interviewed, what kind of contact happened at the time with the victims, the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein. He has repeatedly said that he does not know those details, that in his position he was not briefed on the minutia of the case, which is quite frankly very hard to believe given the gravity of the case and given the fact that Jeffrey Epstein was, of course, such a high-profile individual at that time in our society. So just quite evasive and frankly not remorseful.
You mentioned, Congresswoman, that oversight Democrats were putting forth some pressing questions. Chairman Comer predicted that the deposition would be very challenging for the former Trump Labor Secretary. I wonder if you get the sense that Republicans are also pressing him.
When I was in the room, there were a couple of Republican members sitting in the back. We're going back and forth between Republican questions and Democratic questions. I don't think that they are pressing him in the same way. I think another really important line of questioning to be asked and requires a response is, why did Donald Trump appoint somebody with zero experience that is relevant to be the labor secretary during his first administration? These are the questions I intend to ask when I return to the room. Why was he given that appointment? Why did he resign? What sort of pressure did he feel regarding the Jeffrey Epstein case? I don't know if I'll get a clear response from him, but I think these are really important questions. And also, I want to remind folks that while Alex Acosta is a very important part of this investigation underway, he's also just a small part of it. There is a massive cover-up underway in real time right now. And something that we are working on is following the money. Why did the DOJ just provide us with very redacted files with financial transactions that we need to be aware of in order to get to the bottom of everything?
I just want to ask, because you did make the claim that the president is taking actions partly through deploying National Guard in Washington, D.C. and everything that goes with that. You've accused the administration of trying to distract from the ongoing investigation into Jeffrey Epstein to cover up the president's connection to his former friend in Palm Beach. Do you have specific evidence that the president committed wrongdoing as an associate of Epstein?
That's not what we're looking for. We want the unredacted full Epstein files, and Donald Trump has the power, of course, as president of the United States, to release those files at any moment. He could do so today, and he refuses to do so. His Department of Justice is slow rolling, providing these documents that have been officially subpoenaed by the Oversight Committee in Congress. So it's not a matter of whether Donald Trump is guilty in crimes related to Jeffrey Epstein. His White House is now covering up the truth of this, even when they have been subpoenaed by the United States Congress. So that is the problem. That is the cover-up. And the cover-up is a crime in and of itself.
Congresswoman Yassamin Ansari, we have to leave the conversation there. Appreciate you sharing your time and perspective.
Thank you for having me.
So the American Medical Association has just